Nature's Archive Podcast, a Jumpstart Nature production.
Snakes are a perfect topic for Nature's Archive. They're often overgeneralized to fit a worst-case stereotype, but they're critically important to our food webs and ecosystems. And like so much of what we discuss, once you start learning just a bit about them, you see how amazing and diverse they are. And there are few better suited to guide us through the world of snakes than Dr. Emily Taylor. Dr. Taylor is a professor of biological sciences at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo and has been studying mating systems and physiology of rattlesnakes for 25 years. She's also a founder of Project Rattlecam, which monitors a huge prairie rattlesnake rookery in Colorado. She's founder of Central Coast Snake Services and also an author. And in fact, her latest book, California Snakes and How to Find Them, comes out on May 7th, 2024, which is literally tomorrow from the original release date of this podcast episode. Today, we discuss the diversity of snakes across the United States. And I have to say, I kept saying United Snakes when I tried to read this the first time. And of course, we also discuss how to find snakes, just like in the title of her book. We talk about what different snakes eat, why the kingsnake is named Kingsnake, why live animals can't simply claw their way out of a snake's belly, and what it's like to be surrounded by dozens of rattlesnakes all rattling at the same time. Of course, we also discuss how snakes contribute to our ecosystems and the threats that they face. Dr. Taylor can be found on Instagram, Twitter, and Threads as @SnakeyMama, and that is linked in the show notes. Also, if you happen to be listening to this podcast the week of its release and you live near the San Francisco Bay Area, Dr. Taylor will be appearing at West Valley College on Friday, May 10th, giving her talk, Secret Lives of Snakes, and also signing her books. So I'll be there, and I hope I can see some of you too. You can check EmilyTaylorScience.com for additional events and speaking engagements across California and information about all of the work that she does. So without further delay, Dr. Emily Taylor. Dr. Taylor, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to talk about snakes.
Yes, of course, always. And as we were chatting a little bit here before hitting record, I've been wanting to have this discussion for a long time. And now we have an excellent excuse. And that's your new book that's coming out here in just a few weeks.
That's right. Yep. Been waiting a long time. It comes out on May 7th, 2024. California Snakes and How to Find Them. I'm really excited to talk to you about that book and about snakes more broadly.
Great. And before we get into the details of all of that, I always like to ask this because it's always an interesting story. But where did you grow up and how did you get interested in nature?
I was a Navy brat, so I moved every 2 or 3 years of my life. So I don't really have a home base. I lived all up and down the coasts, west and east coasts of the United States, and then also some stints in Europe and Hawaii. So I was not growing up running around chasing snakes in the backyard. I wasn't scared of snakes, but I wasn't particularly interested by them. I was a late bloomer herpetologist. It wasn't until college. I went to UC Berkeley, and it was a class called Natural History of the Vertebrates, a famous class that has single-handedly switched many a pre-med, pre-vet student over into becoming a scientist by showing them animals in the wild. And that was what did it for me. And for me, it was the snakes.
So part of that class was going out in the wild looking for snakes?
Yeah, the class was pretty amazing because you had 2 labs each week. One was in the classroom looking at preserved specimens and learning about these animals. And then the other one was a field trip. And so every week on Saturday, we would go out either bird watching or mammal trapping or snake hunting. And of course, I fell for the latter.
Yeah, I think the hands-on aspect is so important. I know I missed out on that. I'm a late bloomer as well, though I didn't take an academic route like you have. And I always think back to like my biology courses in high school and, well, especially high school had a field component, maybe things would have turned out very differently for me.
I totally agree with you. I think that the university I'm at right now, Cal Poly, our motto is learn by doing. And we have the students actually out there doing the various things they're learning about, which is clearly what I was also doing at UC Berkeley in that Natural History of the Vertebrates class. We not only did we get a chance to really see the animals up close, but we did our own research project as part of that class. So they were doing the learn by doing thing back then. And it's just super important for grabbing naturalists and grabbing scientists and showing them how to do those things and whether or not we would like them. And turns out I did. I liked it a lot. I needed more.
What was it about the snakes that you were able to see in that class that hooked you?
For me, there was a couple different things. The first one was their relative rarity. So they were something that was a little bit harder to find. It was more of a challenge. You would go out and you would look around. When you found one, it was a big deal. And I think rarity can breed appreciation in a lot of people because it's not like a dime a dozen. And the second thing was the fact that there's some danger involved, like the fact that rattlesnakes represented possibly danger. Not that I was like, I want to get bit, nothing like that, but just because it was something that was, I don't know, tomboyish and exotic to be interested in. And then I think for the non-rattlesnakes too, it was the idea of, like you said, being hands-on, being able to pick up these animals and hold them in your hand and see them up close and appreciate them for what they are. And then after that, it really just turned into, whoa, how does this animal get all this stuff done without any hands? And what are these really cool adaptations that it has to be able to survive and thrive and pretty much rule the roost without even being able to like chew up a bite of food or all the things that they can do? It just amazed me.
Yeah. And already the questions are just stirring so much. I often have a problem where there are so many questions wanting to come out. It's hard for me to pick the one to start with. So why don't we just start with a broad perspective? You're talking about these amazing adaptations they have, their amazing lifestyles. Can you paint a picture of the diversity of snakes in California, maybe in North America more generally?
Yeah, sure. We're in a huge diversity hotspot when it comes to snakes. Not as much as something like in the tropics, but in terms of temperate zones, California and the United States has a really good number of snakes. So there's about 50 species of snakes in California, depending on, some scientists might say that these two different groups of snakes are subspecies or they might be separate species. But so it's around 50, give or take. And again, depending on people's opinions of the taxonomy, maybe there's about 150 in the whole country. So California has a huge diversity of snakes because of the fact that it's a latitudinally big state, because we have the coast influence, because we have so many different habitats. We have desert, we have mountains. And there's snakes from all different kinds of families as well. So we have vipers like rattlesnakes. There are boas like rosy boas and rubber boas. There's little blind snakes. There's just lots of different types of snakes. And there's about 4,000 snake species in the entire world. So we're doing pretty good in terms of a temperate area for our diversity, both in terms of the number of species, but also their lifestyles.
And let's get into that a little bit. Like, what are some of the most incredible adaptations that you like to point out about snakes and how they live their life? And I'm sure this is widely varied depending on which snake and which environment.
Yeah, it varies a lot. One of the most impressive ones that I like to talk about is because it's a subject of my current research in my lab at Cal Poly, is the ability of rattlesnakes to be able to go long periods of time without food and water. So I think people generally may know that snakes don't have to eat as much as a mammal does, right? It's an ectotherm. It doesn't use a bunch of energy to produce its own body heat. It relies more on heat from the environment. Well, rattlesnakes, even compared to other snakes, have like an order of magnitude lower metabolism. So they're just these machines sitting and waiting for something to run by. They shut down their whole body. They're not spending barely any energy at all on keeping themselves alive. They're just barely alive in these periods of time when there's not a lot of food around, not a lot of water. They can easily withstand these droughts that extend throughout California for long periods of time. And then boom, a rodent runs by and switches on their metabolism. Their heart can grow overnight by like a large amount in size. Their kidneys upregulate. Their gut starts to make these enzymes, and they spend energy to be able to then eat that energy. So rattlesnakes can actually survive off of, well, they could probably survive off of no food for a year or two, but they only need like a single ground squirrel to maintain their body weight in 1 year, which is really, really amazing. That's like the calories that are in about half of a Chipotle burrito. Pretty impressive what they can do. And then now our research is also showing that among vertebrates, they seem to have the ability to be able to withstand losing water and not getting a replacement water in it by drinking for an extended period of time too. So the rattlesnake shall inherit the earth, right? We keep talking about cockroaches being the ones left over when we're all gone, but it might be the rattlesnakes too.
Wow. I'm kind of envisioning this situation where the rattlesnake is in this like low energy use state. And you mentioned a rodent could run by and it can snap out of it. So that initial snapping out of it where it catches the rodent, then it's like that very night is when the heart grows and the kidneys upregulate and all of that just happening like hours later.
Absolutely. Yeah. So the data, this has been primarily studied in pythons, but it's also been studied in rattlesnakes as well, including Brandon Kong, my graduate student right now, who I understand you've interviewed on this podcast before. His master's research is on the effect of starvation on these animals and how it affects their organs. And they just can grow them overnight, literally within 24 hours. They dramatically upregulate and start churning away and doing what they're supposed to be doing. So it's really impressive that they can shut everything down in times of scarcity and then upregulate it rapidly in times of plenty.
Definitely. Let's talk a little bit about their predation tactics as well. So different, well, maybe even we take a step back. What about diets? So when we're looking at the spectrum of snakes in North America, the Western US, California specifically, are they all eating small mammals and birds and things like that? Or are there other diets as well?
This is a really fun question because my very first research project as an undergraduate at UC Berkeley was to study the diet of a specific species of snake. It was the Baja California rattlesnake. And I got to cut open museum specimens and see what was inside of them. And so this is a really important part of natural history research because, for conservation biology reasons and other reasons, knowing what animals eat is really, really important to understanding how to conserve them and also to see what role they play in the environment. And truly, the role that snakes play in the environment, one of the most important parts of it is the role they play in the food web, both in terms of what they eat and what eats them. And so it varies dramatically, the diet of a snake, based on its position in the ecosystem. So we've got little tiny blind snakes in the genus Rena, for example, that eat like termites and mainly termite eggs and larvae.
And these snakes are like the size of a large worm.
Exactly.
Like
Sometimes people mistake them for an earthworm if they see one out, but they have little scales on them, so they're a snake. So they just eat like little eggs. There are some species of snakes like the night snake, which is, again, small, about the size of a pencil, and they live off of lizards and lizard eggs. There are then plenty of bigger snakes that kind of graduate up to eating more vertebrates. So things like rattlesnakes in California, they eat primarily lizards, the smaller species, or when they're young, and then they grow up to eat more rodents, including some of the big rattlesnakes may eat larger rabbits. And then we have really fun ideas like the California Kingsnake, which is a diet generalist. They eat all kinds of things. They eat lizards, birds, frogs, and then they eat other snakes, including rattlesnakes. And so they're resistant to rattlesnake venom, and they are a major predator of rattlesnakes, which is, I think, pretty exciting. A lot of people like to hear about that. They find it fascinating how the king snakes can eat rattlesnakes.
Is that why they're called king snakes?
You know what? I'm not sure about that. That's a really good question. It very well might be. It's maybe because I know that king cobras over in Asia also are snake eaters. In fact, their scientific name is Ophiophagus, eats snakes. So I'm sure that the word king has to do with the idea that both these animals are the king of snakes because they eat other snakes. But I don't know the exact etymology of that.
Right. Just this last weekend, our local county park had a snake pop-up event. And I took my daughter over there and we got to see a couple of king snakes up close, which is really cool. They are beautiful snakes and they do attract a slightly different perspective based on this very diet that they have.
Yes, they do. They're amazing snakes. Yeah, even some people who don't like snakes will post pictures of king snakes in their yard, which they leave unharmed, which is great. And they'll say, I had a good snake in my yard today. So even the most stalwart snake haters are going to appreciate king snakes.
And I'm sure that like this audience, people that listen to Nature's Archive, it's a good mix of naturalists and biologists and people that are generally very nature aware. But even then, I encounter a lot of nature aware people that still have a fear of snakes. And the king snake is a good one, a good entry-level charismatic snake.
Agreed.
Now, where I was starting to go with this and backing up, talking about the diets of snakes is the predation tactics. Do you find a similar variety in those tactics?
California really has a good representation of some of the major varieties of ways that snakes can kill prey that we see across the globe. So, for example, a lot of snakes are constrictors, where they will grab a prey with their mouth, and then they wrap their bodies around them and they squeeze them. So that includes things like the king snake we were just mentioning, gopher snakes, and many other species of non-venomous snakes in California. And they don't break the bones or anything. They are disrupting blood flow to and from the heart, and that's how they kill the prey when they squeeze them like that. And then on the other side of the spectrum, we have things like venom. So California has rattlesnakes, which deliver venom via two hollow fangs that are attached to venom glands in their head. These animals have really complex venoms full of tons of proteins that are made to kill their prey and to maybe help tenderize their prey from the inside out to help facilitate digestion, possibly. And then there's a lot of other snakes that technically have a venom as well. They're just not venomous to humans. They're not dangerously venomous to humans. So garter snakes are a good example. They have smaller teeth that are in the back of their mouths, and they do produce a venom that helps to kill prey, like, for example, maybe small rodents, but mostly frogs and fish that they eat. And that venom is completely, useless against people. And then finally, some snakes in California don't really constrict and they don't kill with venom. They just grab a prey and just wolf it down. And so things like coach whips are a good example of that. And some of the striped racers and whip snakes, they just grab prey and the struggling prey just disappears down their throat alive, which is pretty crazy. As my students say, it's metal.
So here's maybe childish, cartoonish perspective. So if a snake swallows some prey whole and that prey has sharp teeth and sharp claws, what's going on inside the snake before that prey finally succumbs?
Yeah, unfortunately, although we like to think about the idea that the prey might be trying to scratch its way out or something, that's probably not the case because the digestive tract of the snake is like a thick-walled muscle, and it has squeezed that animal's arms up against the sides of its body, so it's really immobile, and it will be relatively quickly destroyed by the acidic contents of the snake's stomach. That said, this is all stuff that we're imagining because I don't think anyone has ever stuck a camera down there to see. I think it'd be a morbid study to follow the fate of a living animal as it goes down the snake's maw.
Yes, it would.
It doesn't happen that often, I should say, too. The vast majority of snakes kill their prey before eating them, for sure.
Okay. And back to the kingsnake, and you said the kingsnake is a constrictor. So I'm thinking about the anatomy of another snake. Like, let's say the kingsnake, presumably it constricts rattlesnakes too?
Yes.
Okay. So that constriction, and sorry again if this is morbid, like I want to talk about how cool snakes are, and I'm talking about a lot of death here.
But it's cool how they kill their prey, right? Everything's got to eat.
So the constriction, what is happening to that prey snake when it's being constricted? Is it suffocating? Is it like something damaging the vertebrae? Like what's going on there?
Hey, nature enthusiast, do you want to be part of something bigger? Well, we're building a movement at Jumpstart Nature, and we've just added some new volunteers to help with our podcast and website. But this means our costs are going up too. I need to purchase software licenses to give them access to the production tools we use. For example, one media editing license costs $21 a month. And this is where you come in. Please consider supporting our mission by contributing to Jumpstart Nature through our Patreon or direct contributions, or even purchasing some logo merch. Check out all these options at jumpstartnature.com/donate, also linked in the show notes. Not ready to make a financial contribution? Then please share this episode with 3 friends. Sharing what we do is actually one of the very best ways you can help us. Thank you all for your continued support.
So this has really been studied primarily in constrictors killing mammals, but the principles should probably apply to any prey that's being constricted. Historically, there was a lot of hypotheses put forward. Is it preventing them from breathing? Is it literally squishing them? And all of the data point to the idea that it is impacting the blood flow. So there's this thing in physiology called the Frank-Starling mechanism where it's, I don't know, maybe a little bit dull for this type of podcast, but it basically says that the amount of blood leaving the heart should be proportional to the amount coming back. And so if you squeeze an animal's cardiovascular system and put it under such pressure, that alters the ability of the blood to leave the heart, so therefore alters the ability of blood to come back to the heart, and the blood flow stops. And then eventually the prey animal's brain would cease activity, which is what's actual death. Now, sometimes they may ingest the prey when it's knocked out and before it's entirely died. These are the kind of things that really haven't been studied in a lot of detail. But it's incapacitated when they swallow it.
Yeah, definitely your description. And by the way, I think it's perfect for this podcast having these. I love like ecological concepts, and especially when there's a label and you can go look it up and learn more.
Yes.
But I think that helps at least paint a picture of some of what's going on there.
Awesome.
What other kind of particularly fascinating or surprising behaviors have you seen exhibited, or have you or your lab studied?
Well, I think that my lab has done a lot of work over the years in physiology, right? We study things like energetics and thermal physiology, hydric physiology, how rattlesnakes are dealing with climate change from a temperature perspective, from a drought perspective, for example. But more recently, we've really gotten interested in studying behavior. And then, of course, as a naturalist, I just like to watch snake behaviors in the wild. And so I think there's 2 things I can mention. The first one is something that comes up a lot in the book that I wrote, which is about snake watching, which is the idea that when I first started going out and looking for snakes for fun, I would pick up any snake that I found. Maybe not a rattlesnake right away, but I'd pick up other ones and I wanted to look at it right away. And that's really changed a lot in recent years because I've realized that if I step back and watch the snake, I might get to see something really cool. So the book talks a lot about that ethos, about the idea that, yeah, we understand why we do want to pick up snakes and how that can be appropriate sometimes. I'm not going to try to tell people they shouldn't ever pick up snakes. But also sometimes picking up these animals can be stressful to them. And furthermore, you might miss some really cool stuff. So in the book, I talk about cool things, like my students and I were at a campground once and we saw this gopher snake crossing the campground. And when the students was about to go pick it up, I said, let's wait and see. He looks like he's on the way somewhere. And we watched this gopher snake cross the campground, crawl up a huge oak tree and into a great horned owl nest where the adults started dive bombing this gopher snake. And my students were like, what is happening? And I said, I think I know what's happening. And despite all the dive bombing, the gopher snake came down about half an hour later with 2 big lumps in its belly. And so it had eaten the chicks of these great horned owls. And of course, that's really sad, right? So, to some people, I thought it was pretty amazing that we got to see this. Of course, if we had picked up that gopher snake, we would have missed that entirely. So seeing these really cool behaviors is something that you can do if you sit back and watch snakes and don't interfere with them. That's my first thing. The second thing is that I've recently become pretty obsessed with snake behavior through a research project that I started with my collaborator, Scott Boback from Dickinson College. It's called Project Rattlecam. And this project involves using new technology to be able to spy on snakes with secret cameras. So long story short, I can tell you more about this later if you're curious, is we have years of putting time-lapse cameras on rattlesnakes in these big gatherings so we can go back and study them later on. But 3 years ago, we also started a live streaming camera. I mean, everyone's putting live streaming cameras in eagle's nests and hawk nests and falcon nests. It's about time we have one in a rattlesnake nest. And indeed, there's these communal birthing areas that some rattlesnakes go to. And I'm very excited because this May 2024, we're putting up the first live streaming camera at a big rattlesnake den where there's going to be lots of activity of snakes all year round. And we've just learned so much from that already. So we've learned that when the babies are born, the mothers don't necessarily just take care of their own babies, that the babies move around and interact with lots of other still pregnant mothers and then something that's called babysitting. We've learned that the babies are born thirsty already and that instinctively they'll curl up into these little cinnamon roll shapes and collect rainwater on their backs when it's raining, like the day they're born, which is pretty impressive. And we're just learning lots of more really, really cool things from this feed, Project Rattlecam, which I should mention, it's a community science project. So people who can check that out at rattlecam.org, especially starting up in May, can participate in helping us to collect the data and in being able to have the privilege of peering into the private lives of these snakes in ways that shows what snakes are actually like, not the kind of fake things that you see on TV shows.
I've looked at Project Rattlecam in the past, and if I recall, the cameras were they in Colorado?
Yeah. So we had the time-lapse cameras in a big mega den, we call it, in Colorado, of prairie rattlesnakes. And then I wanted to put the live streaming camera there. Turns out that the live streaming cameras that you see on wildlife are not easy to put in. If it was, a peregrine falcon nest that's on a building on a campus, that's pretty easy because you have access to power and Wi-Fi. But to get that stuff done remotely is a huge challenge, especially in a place that is very difficult to access and doesn't have good cell signal. So anyway, we have been working for years to get that installed in Colorado. So I've had the live stream in California at a much closer, easier to access den for the past 3 years. But we finally have cracked the code and it's going in to this mega den in Colorado where we can watch hundreds of prairie rattlesnakes at once in May. And I should say this is really cool too, because it's not just a static camera. This is a remote controlled camera that we can pan and tilt and zoom. So someone who's watching on YouTube can tell us, can you zoom in on that snake over there? And we'll do it for them right then and there. So, and it's just it's a neat, intimate experience with these rattlesnakes to see the moms taking care of the babies and the snakes babysitting. And we'll be able to have it on at night too, because it's a 24-hour camera. So we'll be able to see any predators that visit the den. It's just going to be obviously in terms of looking and seeing what rattlesnakes do, that's really important, and providing access to the public. It's really exciting. But this is the first time ever in any kind of animal, that you will be able to actually have 100% surveillance of them at all times, to know what they do with all of their time, day and night. Think about any other animal. You can't do that because it flies away or it hides or something like that. But we'll be able to do that, which is so exciting. Can you tell I'm excited?
Yes. I'm excited too. It's rubbing off on me. So you said May. Is it May because that's when it's going in, or May because that's when the snakes become active?
It's both. So the Project Rattlecam site in Colorado is a high elevation site. And so the snakes are still under a bunch of snow right now. And so we're heading out there to install the camera in the very end of April, both because that's when the ground will thaw enough for us to drill into the ground to set the camera up, and also because that's right about the time the snakes start to wake up. So I think in the beginning of May, we'll see snakes occasionally. And then based on experience from visiting, by mid to the end of May, there's going to be lots and lots of snakes. Males, females, babies, everyone comes out of this volcanic outcrop where they've been spending the winter underground together under the snow line, and they all bask during the day, all day long. They interact. They have all these cool social interactions. And then in the beginning of June, the males and the non-pregnant females will all leave, and they'll travel for miles around into the prairie to hunt. But the pregnant females are going to stay behind. And the pregnant females will stay back there basking in the sun, probably getting eaten by red-tailed hawks. Who knows? And then they'll have their babies in September. And so we'll be able to watch that maternal care and check them out. And it's a very short season that they have before the males and the other females come back in September and October. So it's a short active season. It's only about 4 months long that they have over there in Colorado because they're under snow the rest of the year.
So when they're under snow, are they hibernating, or like what would you call their state of condition during the winter?
Yes, I think most people call it hibernation. There are some people who like to grouse about word choice and fuss over things, but as a physiologist, it doesn't bother me at all. Hibernation is an appropriate term. Some mammal biologists like to use it differently, but they have a metabolic depression. In the case of rattlesnakes, the metabolism is depressed or lowered because of the fact that it's so cold out. So we've had temperature data loggers in the snakes throughout the winter, and their body temperature gets to be just almost to freezing. So they don't quite freeze. They keep their body temperature about 1 or 2 degrees Celsius. And they do that by going down these deep fissures and cracks in the rocks to far below the frost line. And we don't know what it looks like down there. We can't get cameras down there. It's just too deep, but there's just lots of snakes. So we think there's probably 2,000 rattlesnakes at this combined, these two little peaks that are side by side, which is a lot of rattlesnakes.
Yeah, that's crazy. I can't imagine stumbling across an emergence of rattlesnakes coming out of hibernation at a den site like that. That's got to be something.
It's pretty amazing to see, let me tell you. I mean, we as scientists know what to look for, but you see this rocky outcrop surrounded by a ton of prairie. And my colleague, Scott Boback, was on a hunting trip when he saw it. He's like, can I go up there? He went up there, and sure enough, tons of snakes. And once when I was up there, I decided to see something, because when you go up there, the snakes are scared of you. So they all dive down into these little holes. And that's, again, the beauty of the camera is that we're watching their natural behaviors when they're not scared and stressed by the presence of the researcher. It's beautiful for science. But anyway, I sat down and sat still, and the snakes started to come out, and they were like giving me side eye. Is that a person? What is it? But I sat super still, and I just waited. And within about an hour, they all had come back out and just curled up all around me because I had become part of the background. So I was just surrounded by dozens and dozens and dozens of snakes, and they just curl up and they start interacting and doing their thing. And it was the coolest experience to just sit there and watch them and to see how they actually are when I'm not trying to catch them or trying to otherwise study them or harass them. So that's what everyone's going to get to do now without having to actually be there. Everyone gets to see that and participate in that from the comfort of your own couch or your desk. So get an extra monitor to put alongside your other monitor so that you can just have it on the snake cam all day long.
Yeah. I'll link to cheap monitors for people to add to their computers in the show notes. No, I won't do that. But I will link to Project Rattlecam for sure. So I'm just trying to imagine this, when you were sitting there still watching the behavior, and this might involve some conjecture, did the snakes not realize you were there, or just because you weren't acting like a human, they weren't concerned about you? Or do you have any thoughts as to why they became comfortable with you sitting right there?
Yeah, I think it's definitely conjecture, but the snakes, when they were looking at me when they first came out, so they recognized that I was not just part of the background. But then after a while, when I didn't move a muscle at all, they just decided it was okay. And so I think that snakes, the cognition that they have is difficult for us to understand. It's definitely not the same level of reasoning through various options and various outcomes and consequences that we have. I think they're really responding to, is that a threat? And then there's no movement of that threat over time. Okay, fine. Then I'm going to come back out and do my thing. Because of course, when I eventually stood up to leave, they all, oh my God, I'm so scared, and ran away again. So, but
did you get a lot of concurrent rattling when that happened, or they just run away or slither away?
Yes, they rattle like crazy, the ones in the prairie rattlesnake den. Rattlesnakes have just very different personalities. Both some species are more likely to rattle than others. and some individuals are more likely to rattle than others. But these prairie rattlesnakes at the dens, when you walk up, there's just like a couple of males, we think, that kind of start the whole thing. Maybe they're lookout males, who knows? And then everybody just starts rattling. And so I think being up there with your ankles just surrounded by dozens, even hundreds of rattlesnakes at once it's some people's worst nightmare, but it's truly a like it's such an amazing privilege to be able to find a spot like that, these mega dens that are relatively uncommon, because most rattlesnakes don't den up in those huge dens. Like here in California, those are rare. Here in California, snakes either overwinter by themselves, like in a squirrel burrow, or maybe in a rock outcrop with a few other snakes. At high elevations, you can find some dens of rattlesnakes that may have 10s or 20s, but nothing like these multiple hundreds or thousands. So it really is just a neat thing to see. Of course, wearing the right footwear is very important, but as long as you take precautions, those snakes want nothing to do with you. And
do you by chance have any audio recordings of like dozens of rattlesnakes rattling at the same time?
Yes.
I would love to hear that. If it's possible to share it in some way, I would love to hear that.
Sure.
Every rattlesnake encounter I've had where they've rattled, it's just such a memorable experience. And for someone like me, I've only heard a rattlesnake rattle maybe 10 times. I've seen more rattlesnakes that slither away without rattling, but not a lot. So they can I can picture everywhere I've been, including once in my backyard in San Jose, California. There was a rattlesnake that seemed to be shedding its skin. And I don't know if it was seeking refuge to try to shed its skin or exactly what was happening, but it was right by my trash can. And I walked by it to drop off the trash, turned around, and it was right there, and it rattled at me. So it didn't mind me the first pass, but the second pass, it's like, okay, what are you doing? And quite the experience, unexpected experience.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think lots of people in California who have those stories about rattlesnakes found in their yards. And let's face it, there is a difference between watching rattlesnakes on a camera, like you can with Project Rattlecam, or hiking and having the privilege of seeing one crossing the trail in front of you, and then having one in your yard. So that's why I started my company, Central Coast Snake Services. We do free snake relocation out of people's yards here on the Central Coast. And there's lots of people who do that throughout California as well. So people who know how to put that snake from one place into another spot that's going to be a good outcome for that snake. If any of your listeners are interested, there's a website called freesnakerelocation.org where they can go and they can find out. I'm not sure if I got that right. You'll have to edit that out. It might be freesnakerelocationdirectory.org. I'll let you know.
Okay.
But the point is, there's a place that people can go and find people to do that for them if they'd like.
Okay, just to clarify that resource, it doesn't look like there's a direct URL that goes to the Free Snake Relocation Directory. But there is a map that you can zoom in on and click and see who is in your area. So I've included a link to that in the show notes. That's a great resource to have on hand. And in my case, it startled me, but I wasn't necessarily scared of it. So I went in and I got my camera and I went back out to take some pictures of it. And then I went to get my kids so they could see it. And at that point, it was gone. So it was just passing through, I think. Who knows where it went, but a fun experience. You mentioned that some rattlesnakes are more apt to rattle, others not. And here in California, I've always called them Western rattlesnakes. And I know there's some subspecies and things like that. But I've been told, I don't know if this is true, so you can tell me if it's true, but I've been told that the Western rattlesnake tends to be a little bit less aggressive or more docile, I suppose. It would be a better way of positioning it than other rattlesnakes. Is that accurate?
Well, so first of all, yeah, it was great that you thought about your language there, because people say the word aggressive a lot. It means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But truly, aggression is something that an animal, like one animal being aggressive towards another, usually means that they're not trying to defend themselves, that they're like actually maybe trying to eat that other animal. And of course, rattlesnakes aren't going to eat us. So rattlesnakes are technically never aggressive to us, but they can defend themselves aggressively, right? So I like to use the word defensive, right? Okay. That some rattlesnakes are more defensive than others. And I will say a couple different things is that it's been very difficult for people to quantify this. There's been some studies that have been done where you walk up to a rattlesnake with a fake hand. It'll be like a stuffed glove on a stick that goes towards it, and then you can quantify how the rattlesnake reacts. And for the most part, those studies have been, well, they're few and far between, but they have really just showed one thing and one thing only, which is that rattlesnake defensive behavior varies super dramatically. So it's based on the posture that they were in. For example, they are more likely to rattle if they're already stretched out. So if they're curled up like a cinnamon roll, they're unlikely to rattle because that's their first line of defense is camouflage. And they're only going to start rattling if they really think they've been found out, which if they're already crawling, they probably already have. And then it varies according to snake. So I've spent so much time over the years radio tracking many dozens of snakes, and that's been western rattlesnakes here in California, western diamondback rattlesnakes, a different species in Arizona, and then prairie rattlesnakes up in Colorado, as well as just hiking around and seeing other species. Some individuals are just like to rattle at you from like 20 feet away. They're like, hey, rah. And most individuals, though, I would say 80-85%, no matter what species you're talking about, will not rattle. Now, I told you the prairie rattlesnakes like to rattle, but that's like at those dens where there's one of them sets off a bunch of other ones. If you're out in the prairie in the summer and you come across one, again, not as likely to rattle. So the propensity to rattle is overblown on TV. They want to show rattlesnakes all rattling and lunging and looking terrifying. But the reality is that rattlesnakes mostly just curl up and sit there. And even rattlesnakes that we go into people's yards and capture and relocate usually don't rattle. So yeah, I would say that the western rattlesnake, by and large, is very unlikely to give itself away by rattling. Maybe some other species are a little bit more likely on average, but it gets washed out with individual variation. They have personalities just like we do.
I wish that there was a technology like in Star Trek, like a life form indicator that you could just take with you and be like, oh, today on my 5-mile hike, I passed 7 rattlesnakes and didn't even know it. He's like, it's got those numbers have to be through the roof when you think
they
about
are.
how,
I know exactly what you're talking about. Yes, because we miss so many of them.
Yeah.
And that's why we're like, for all the rattlesnakes, you've missed a whole bunch more. Sometimes people don't like hearing that, but it's absolutely true. And I've thought that many times that I wish there was something where it would just like a beacon would just tell me where the snake was, but because I needed them for research or something like that. But then it actually would take all the fun away, right? So the finding the snakes in the wild is just as much fun as actually looking for the snakes in the wild is just as much fun as actually finding them.
So when we were talking about some of the dietary choices of snakes, not just rattlesnakes, but snakes in general, I was thinking about all the pesticides and rodenticides and things that are used across the board in agricultural areas and in suburban areas and all points in between, which leads me to a broader question. What is the general conservation status of snakes? And are they affected by some of these pesticides and rodenticides that are prevalent?
Yeah, this is a great question. So first off, in terms of the conservation status in California of most species of snakes are doing all right. They're doing pretty well, especially if you compare that to, for example, California amphibians, where we have a pretty high number of endangered species. There are some types of snakes that are very sensitive in California. So the giant garter snake is an endangered species. We've got things like the Alameda whip snake, the San Francisco garter snake, which are subspecies that are very rare. There's also a rattlesnake species, the red diamond rattlesnake down in San Diego, that is a California species of special concern. And so that is kind of like saying it's not endangered yet, but we really need to watch out for that. And there's a couple other species that fall under that same moniker. But for the most part, most snakes doing pretty well. There's been no studies done in California on whether rodenticides or other pesticides are impacting snakes. Lots of studies are being done in Australia showing that snakes can be secondarily poisoned by eating, for example, a poisoned rat, a poisoned rodent of some kind. So we know that it can happen, but there's no studies that I know of that are occurring in California right now. We regularly see at Central Coast Snake Services, which operates in Santa Barbara and SLO counties, regularly see snakes that are caught inside rodent traps. So they go in there after a rodent and then they get caught and stuck. Occasionally we'll come across snakes that are acting kind of funny, like they have a neurological disorder and they may have been poisoned. I'm just guessing here that in some cases they recover from that. There's probably some snakes that die from that we don't ever really know about. No systematic study on this. It's something that's really interesting because California, as you might know, is going through a little bit of a revolution right now where they've been banning certain types of rodenticides that people are using. And let me tell you, they are using them like crazy. Like I had no idea how much of this rodenticide is being used until I started getting called to people's yards to pick up rattlesnakes. Almost every house we go to has those little black boxes around it with rodenticide. And it's a big problem, as your listeners know, for poisoning predators of these rodents, things like hawks and owls. And so possibly snakes too. But right now they're banning some of these harmful substances, but as soon as they ban one, there's another one that is made that may be less toxic, but has to be tested. And so this is something that would be great to have a study on the impacts of these toxins on snakes, because we certainly don't know. But I can tell you that it doesn't appear that there's any sensitive species that are being dramatically impacted by that as far as we know.
Well, that's, I guess, generally good news. And it does remind me, though, every time the topic of rodenticides comes up, I think about how the burden of proof is not on the maker of the rodenticide. So it's an unfortunate situation. And I know there's a bunch of groups out there that are working to help improve it from a policy standpoint.
Yes.
Are there any other aspects of snake conservation that you'd like to highlight?
Yeah, there is something I'd like to mention, something that's become very apparent since I started Central Coast Snake Services, which is that snake entrapment. So snakes become trapped in like mesh, including things like bird netting that some folks put around their gardens or up in the eaves of their house to keep birds from nesting up there. Erosion control, like landscaping cloth that has big openings in it. The number of snake entrapments in there is staggering because what happens is they get stuck and then they struggle and eventually they get caught in the sun and they overheat and die. And so we spend all of our spring and summer running around, and everything we do is free, rescuing these snakes. And sometimes they're all cut up and we have to stitch them up. And sometimes it's a rattlesnake that's stuck in this cloth, which is really tricky to get out. Last year I had to get one out that was all caught in its mouth. You can imagine trying to get that mesh out of a rattlesnake's mouth. And I think a lot of people don't know that. And so what I recommend is that people cut out stop using any of the plastic or the cloth netting and replace it instead with something like a metal hardware cloth, which you can put around your garden to keep things out. Because unfortunately, those cloths seem to be snake killers.
I was really surprised when I put in native plants in my front yard. We dug up the lawn that the previous owners had put in, and they apparently had it sodded, and that sod was held together with this plastic netting that covered the entire expanse of the yard. So yeah, it's really is everywhere. I had no idea that was there until we started digging.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, there's other problems with that too, being underground, but like at least it's underground. It's not as likely to get snakes that are cruising around caught in it. But I mean, it can happen, right? Especially as it gets dug up over time. But yeah, like the use of these. So like, again, don't use the black boxes with the poison to keep rodents away. There's other ways to do it. Don't use sticky traps. That's another thing. We rescue lots of snakes and other wildlife from sticky traps. Even the target wildlife, if it's a rodent that you're trying to get, that's a horrible way for that animal to go. So the way that most pest control companies that prioritize humane treatment operate is via snap traps for rodents, because that minimizes bycatch and it's a more humane method of euthanasia. So I would recommend that as well. In other words, anyone who's listening, throw away your erosion control or bird netting and your sticky traps and your poison, and just try to do things with the snap trap way.
And there's other advantages to it. So I will, without belaboring that point too much, I will link to an organization that I like, and I think they do great work. Raptors Are the Solution, or RATS. They talk a lot about how to handle rodents around dwellings and do it in a humane way and a way that works.
Excellent. I need to check that out. Thanks for the recommendation on that too.
Yeah. And I want to get into your book a little more directly. So we talked a little bit about your book at the onset, but let's get into it in more depth. So again, remind me of the title. I looked at the advanced copy. I didn't commit the title to memory.
No problem. I certainly have the title committed to memory because I've been obsessing over this book for so many years now. It's called California Snakes and How to Find Them, which any Harry Potter fan might recognize as a nod to another book in that family of titles, Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them, because of course snakes are the most fantastic beasts of all. And the book is about the species of snakes that live in California and about how to find them in the wild. So it's both a kind of like a little mini field guide, although it's not technical. So this is not a replacement for a field guide. There's an awesome field guide to California amphibians and reptiles that's coming out this year by Princeton University Press, by Bob Hansen and Jackson Shedd. So I recommend that for technical aspects of California snakes. But this one is more storytelling, some basics about how to tell them apart from other snakes and information about their conservation status, but also how to actually find them in the wild. Because lots of people are interested in snakes. People have an opinion one way or the other. Lots of people hate them or are scared of them, but a lot of other people are absolutely fascinated by them and they want to see them in the wild. They just don't know how. Snakes are really, really secretive. It's not as easy as bird watching, where you go out and point at binoculars at something and you can find it. So there's actually an art to snake hunting. And I think that I wrote this book to try to help entry-level herpers figure out how to learn that for themselves. The truth of the matter is that finding a mentor can be really hard in field herping. People don't want to tell you, go to this spot because it's a spot they've been herping for years, and they don't want someone to come and destroy it, whether that's on purpose or on accident. So people are very cagey about their spots. And so there's therefore a lot of gatekeeping in field herpetology. So my goal was to teach people how to find these spots and find these snakes themselves, and then also how to do it in an ethical way. So how to do things like protecting the environment. When you're flipping cover objects for snakes, how and why you should replace them exactly as found. Ways that you should handle snakes, ways that you should not handle snakes, like we talked about earlier, why you may want to just watch them instead of just grabbing them all the time. How to minimize problems that you may be unwittingly introducing. Like there's an emerging pathogen that's impacting snakes. It's called snake fungal disease. And so we recommend that people are cleaning off their footwear in specific ways when they walk around areas where there could be snakes, because they could be unwittingly passing this pathogen from one to the next. If you're catching snakes and putting them in bags, you definitely could be getting those fungal spores from one snake to the next. So it's mainly an entry-level book that is, with beautiful photographs by Marissa Ishimatsu and a number of other photographers. But it's also, I think, appropriate for people who just like snakes, probably mainly because of those incredible photos. You can't get enough of those epic photos. I chose 2 types of photos for each snake in the book. There's a kind of a close-up headshot showing the detail of the snake's scales on its head. And then there's at least one, sometimes more, snakes in habitat photos. And that's what Marissa's so really good at. She doesn't just take a snake and set it up and just show the snake on the ground. She really shows what it might look like on a wide angle in its habitat. And since the book was about finding snakes in the natural habitat, I wanted the photographs to reflect that. So really it's a how-to. It's something people can take with them. It's a paperback. It's $22, so it's accessible to folks. And visitors to our state who are picking it up at a state park or a national park can take that. It fits well into someone's, Christmas stocking, right? Things like that. And then, of course, it's the first book. There may be other ones on other animals coming after that.
That's great news. And just a comment on Marissa. I saw her at the Wildlife Society just like a month ago and some of her photographic artwork. And yeah, she's a great photographer. So big thumbs up on that and the photography that's in the book. And I'll make sure to link to her social media as well in the show notes. Now, you talk in the book a lot about finding snakes, and obviously it's in the title. It's a big part of it. Maybe you can share a couple of ideas or tips here with the listeners. And one thing that I know when I'm out leading groups and we're talking about snakes is that to a casual observer, someone who maybe hasn't really spent time with snakes or spent time looking at them, a snake is a snake. They're kind of all the same. So what can people start to look at to assess a snake from a distance and get an idea for what type of snake it might be? Yeah,
great question. The first thing is a snake's posture. So if you see a snake that's curled up like a cinnamon roll, 99% of the time it's a rattlesnake that's resting in ambush posture, waiting for a rodent to run by. So that's really cool because you can stay about 10 feet away, zoom in with your camera, cell phone, take photos, check out this really cool snake, what it's doing. If a snake is stretched out, it could be a rattlesnake going on its merry way, but in that case, you would see the rattle on the end of its tail. Or it could be any number of California's harmless snakes that are out and about. So the best way to look for snakes is to hike in areas where they are and to just look on the ground, look off of the trail to find out, to see if you can see those snakes. And sometimes you'll see a curled up rattlesnake. Sometimes it's out in the open. More often than not, they might be in California, not out in the open. They might be curled up with like their back, to the extent they have a back, like up against the base of a bush or a rock. But you might also see a snake that's crossing the trail in front of you. And in that case, you really want to be looking for, okay, rattle on the tail, yes, no. If not, if they have a pointy tail, it's harmless in California. Pointy tail means harmless in California. Then you can say, well, does it have blotches on it? In that case, it might be something like a gopher snake. Does it have stripes going down its body? In that case, it might be something like a garter snake or a whip snake. Does it have bands going like rings around your finger, around its body? That might be a kingsnake. And the book really goes into, that level of detail in terms of being able to distinguish one snake species from the next, and also where they live in California, what times of year and day they might be out, what they might be doing when you see them, to help you start to identify that. Because once you start to see oh, this is a different kind of snake. Oh, this is a ringneck snake, or maybe even a mountain king snake or something that's really exciting like that because it's so rare to see in the wild. That's when things get really more fun. Just like bird watchers, right? Bird watchers aren't going to just sit and watch the crows in their yard all the time. They're going to go out and look for different species that are harder to find. You can do the same thing with snakes. And when you do find one, you can brag about it even more because they're harder to find than most birds.
That's right. And this episode, if my schedule stands, I will release this on May 6th, Monday, May 6th, which is good timing for the book release too. What would people say in California? What should they be looking for that time of year?
Oh my gosh. Go for snakes, go for snakes, go for snakes, go for snakes. So beginning of May is peak gopher snake activity. I cannot leave my house without seeing gopher snakes crawling across the road. And those are like male gopher snakes that are hopped up on testosterone, that are cruising around looking for girl gopher snakes. So that's really a major one. And gopher snakes live almost everywhere in California. So that's the single thing that people are most likely to see. It's also beginning to be the peak season for rattlesnake activity. So rattlesnake males also will be out looking for females. If anyone sees a big rattlesnake, that's a male. The females don't get big in rattlesnakes. So those are some of the things that you'll see that time of year. In addition, if you're walking near an aquatic area, you might see a lot of garter snakes that have come out from hibernation and they're cruising around. Like if you see a striped snake as you're walking along a pond or a lake or a stream and it dives into the water, or even sometimes if it dives into the bushes, it's probably a garter snake. So those are some of the things you can see. You can also start to see snakes when you're driving. So one of the main techniques that we discuss in the book, and which is definitely well known to any seasoned herpetologist, is something called road cruising for snakes. And this is especially important at night in the summer when it gets to be really warm, but it also can be done in the spring during the daytime for some snakes that are moving around. The idea is that by driving around on these remote roads where snakes are crossing the road, you're covering more ground than you would by hiking. And so you can see snakes that are on the move. And it can be a really fruitful way to find snakes. I see tons of gopher snakes road cruising, tons of rattlesnakes road cruising during the daytime in the spring. And then that snake activity tends to transition more into nighttime, especially in the inland areas where it gets to be really hot in the summer. So you have to follow the temperature, right? You have to be out looking for snakes at times when it's comfortable for them, and which is usually when it's comfortable for you. If you're comfortable in a t-shirt and shorts outside, then the snakes probably are as well, as a general rule of thumb.
So something that I've always wondered about with the nighttime seeing snakes along the side of a road, I always thought that they were thermoregulating. They found a nice warm spot to hang out, which may or may not be true. Please correct me. But what my question is, here in where I live in the Bay Area, we can have some very hot days in the summer, but it still very frequently cools off a lot at night. And quickly, when the sun goes down, if the sea breeze comes over the mountains and starts blowing in that cool air, does that affect snake behavior, or is it still going to be similar? Kind of a vague question, but I hope that makes sense.
No, it's fine. I think the best rule of thumb is quite literally is to say when you're comfortable outside in a t-shirt and shorts. Now, noticing this is a rule of thumb, right? Some snakes are going to be out when it's hotter, some will be out when it's colder. But in the Bay Area, snakes tend to be more often diurnal, out during the day. Now, if it's a super hot day, they're out. They're just not out in the sun. They're curled up or cruising around in the shade. At nighttime, if it cools down, they're still going to be out because it's nice out. But if it gets really cold, then they're not going to be. They're probably going to hide. So they could be above ground, but they're just not active. So we start to learn over time when to go out and look for these snakes. So in the Bay Area, definitely daytime hiking is always your best bet. In the middle of the summer, when it's really hot in San Jose, going out in the morning, going out in the evening right before sunset, that's peak time for snakes. If we're talking about May or June in the Mojave Desert, most snake species are going to be out in the middle of the night, or I shouldn't say middle of the night, right after sunset is the peak time for them when it starts to cool down. Now, there are some species of snakes that don't come out at night at all. They're only out during the day, and vice versa. And that's especially true in the desert where you have some more strictly diurnal snakes and strictly nocturnal snakes. But along the coast, most of the snakes that we see a lot of, gopher snakes, rattlesnakes, garter snakes, their activity follows the temperatures. They're usually out during the day, and occasionally you can find them at night if it's a particularly warm evening. Got it.
Yeah, I think maybe getting a little hung up on the whole inland thing because there's spectrums of inland, and it's really more the temperature as opposed to the proximity. So thank you. That's very helpful.
Yep.
Is there anything else that you'd like to say about the book?
I will say that I'm doing a mini book tour in May and June throughout California. So people can go to emilytaylorscience.com and look on the events tab to see if there's an event near them. And I'm going to be giving a talk called The Secret Lives of Snakes, where I talk about things like being paparazzi and spying on snakes with secret cameras and some of the really cool things we've learned, showing off a bunch of Marissa's and other photographers, amazing photography, and reading some excerpts from the books and also signing books. So I hope people can make it to those. It's some of those events, including one that if this podcast is coming out in early May, would be of interest to a lot of your listeners, is that on May 11th in Sacramento is the Sacramento Snake Festival. And I will be there all day along with Marissa and along with a ton of other snake people to help celebrate snakes. So check back that website for events.
That's cool. For those of us in California, we'll try to get out and support you in that. One question I like to ask a lot of my guests, and that is, what have you found to be most effective in moving people up a rung in environmental awareness?
I love this question because this is something that I've gotten really interested in as a scientist. So I'm a physiologist, right? I do these experiments that I design, and then we analyze the data, and we have rigorous data analysis, and we publish it. And yet when I do outreach, I'm just following my instinct in terms of what works and what doesn't work. So recently we actually decided to try to apply our experimental design expertise to this question of how to do outreach best. And it's really blossomed into this like whole side project of a bunch of research that we're doing in my lab and with collaborators. So briefly, we recently completed a study that was actually led by a graduate student named Erin Allison out of West Liberty University in West Virginia. We worked together with Advocates for Snake Preservation, which is a really cool nonprofit, and we launched this study, which, to make a long story short, we looked at how conservation messaging, impacted people's opinions of rattlesnakes. So people would take a pre-survey to determine what they thought of snakes in general, and then they would watch one of two movies, and one of them was about the important ecosystem services that rattlesnakes give us in terms of eating rodents that would otherwise be destroying plants and crops and keeping rodent-borne diseases under control, those types of things. And the other one was about more of an affect. It was about snakes as having families and friends, and the mothers taking care of the babies, and more of a personalizing them in a certain way, which is a common outreach technique. And then they took another survey at the end. So we could see which one was more effective. And it was really interesting because we found all kinds of complicated results that are fascinating to me. For example, we found that the ecosystem services approach was more effective in older people. For example, people who are baby boomers. So in other words, it seems like for whatever reason, people who are older are more likely to be interested in what the snakes do for us. And then we found that people who identify as women were much more likely to respond to the friends and family approach about rattlesnakes. And so there's a bunch more too that we found in terms of what is most effective. But those types of things have now shaped the way I do outreach. When I'm talking to a person, I may focus on one more than the other of those things based on actual evidence, which is super exciting. And above all else, one thing that we learned, which is really important, I think, and not too surprising, is that the younger the people are, the more likely they are to change their minds about snakes. So the ability to have your mind changed goes down as people get older. And we all know that when we see little kids with snakes. They love snakes. They have not yet formed these negative opinions based on what society tells them about snakes. And so that has now informed us to begin a couple really cool projects. So working on expanding that research to the whole rest of the world with something called Snakefluence. It's a project led by Dr. Christina Zdenek over in Australia. And she is working with a couple of my grad students and other folks on testing how outreach techniques impact people's opinion on snakes in general throughout the world. So there's 22 countries involved in that right now. The second one is that my graduate students are working with teachers in training here at Cal Poly on a project called Rattle Ed. Get it? Rattled. It's very cute. And they're developing basically an educational unit for fourth graders where they're going to have a science notebook and they're actually going to collect data from the rattle cam, from the live streaming camera, to be able to analyze what rattlesnakes are doing. And we're also simultaneously going to be studying on these kids the impact of this experience with rattlesnake education, what it has on their opinions of snakes. So I've really dove into this human dimensions of wildlife and human wildlife conflict resolution aspect of my career that is very, very different from what I previously did. But it's exciting. It's really exciting to be able to have a more science-based approach to our outreach now to help snakes in their plights.
Yeah, I'm excited hearing it because part of what Jumpstart Nature is all about is reaching people. So we really lean into best practices of science communication and nature interpretation and all of these things. There's a whole psychology side to this too.
Absolutely.
So hearing this is interesting. And of course, I also have an engineering background and a very analytical background. So when I hear you talking about the results of that first study, I'm also thinking, well, what about other personality traits? Like as engineers, ecosystem services are they're defined, and maybe that would resonate with an audience full of engineers, regardless of age or regardless of self-identified sex. And there's so many dimensions to this. And I guess for me, it just comes back to you need a variety of approaches and try to align it to the audience as best you can. But it'll be fun to follow along with some of this research that's coming out to help in that endeavor.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, that study is coming out in PLOS One any day now. I'm not quite sure, but it should be out by the time, hopefully. Fingers crossed that the podcast airs.
Nice. And if I could throw one other question in, it's one that in this communication realm that I struggle with a little bit. And one of the things that we really try to do is educate people on the importance of biodiversity. And it's a difficult concept for a lot of people to grasp because it is a little bit abstract, it's indirect. So there are different techniques that you can try to gain a toehold in that conversation to help show someone that this is why biodiversity is important. How might you advocate for biodiversity, perhaps through the lens of snakes?
That's another good question as well. And part of that harkens back to what I mentioned before, which is that you can talk to people about what these animals do for you, right? How they're important in the ecosystem. But you can also, there's another way, especially when it comes to things that these animals produce, including venoms. That's not the only thing, but a good example with rattlesnakes is venoms and how those are important. And I found this one to be qualitatively, because we haven't studied it yet, qualitatively very impactful, is the notion that rattlesnake venoms are now saving more lives than they are taking. And that is because of the combined effect of the efficacy of antivenom. So if people are treated with antivenom, then it's very unlikely they'll have further medical problems. Not minimizing rattlesnake bites. They're very, very, very serious, to be avoided at all costs. But the point is that they can be cured now, whereas in the past, maybe not so easily. But that the venoms now are being used to make numerous drugs. So there's drugs on the market. In fact, any one of the listeners right now who knows someone who has heart disease are probably impacted by a drug made from rattlesnake venom, because people take that drug to prevent clots from forming. In fact, rattlesnake venoms work primarily by an anticoagulant effect. They prevent blood clotting. So in a pharmaceutical lab that harnesses the power of that and delivers that as a drug can help prevent clots from forming, for example, if someone's getting a stent put into their heart. So this is really powerful, I think, is the idea that nature has already figured out a lot of solutions to what we need. And it's much, much faster to be able to look to nature to be able to solve those issues, including the incredible wealth of drugs that are being developed from secretions from animals, whether it be their venoms or whether it be toxic secretions from newts or something else that's on their skin. And that's just, I think, something that most people really appreciate. And so I try to read my audience and provide them with anecdotes and stories like that to help explain to them why biodiversity is important. Because if those rattlesnakes weren't there, we would not have that venom to draw our inspiration from for these drugs.
I like it. It's really a memorable commentary to say that more people are saved from rattlesnake venom than not. So I think,
yes, I agree.
That resonates for sure.
And people don't know that.
Right. An element of surprise.
So,
yes.
Yeah, it's an important one, I think.
Very cool. And you already hinted at a couple of your upcoming projects and your tour that will be coming up as well. Do you have anything else, any other projects that you'd like to highlight?
Well, my graduate students are always hard at work on their research. So if you continue to follow me on any of the social medias at Snakey Mama, at Kingsnake, at Rattlecams, you're going to hear about their work, which really spans things like Project Rattlecam, to be able to study snake science and to be able to involve you, your listeners, in snake science, but also the other side projects that they do. My grad students are always amazing with their outreach events and the projects that they're doing, like Rattle Ed, to try to understand how to fix some of the damage that has been caused by these sensationalist TV shows. So my advice to people is follow the right people on the social medias, those free handlers on YouTube, etc. It's not good. It's no bueno. They get the clicks and likes, but it's really about looking at the researchers and the conservation biologists and the people doing responsible outreach all around you. That's the important way forward.
All right. Well, I'm sure if people start following you at the social media handles that you mentioned, then they'll start to learn about a few of the other people that you interact with online as well, and be able to grow that Yeah.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. And I mean, here in California, we have a wonderful nonprofit dedicated to snakes. It's called Save the Snakes. It's out of Sacramento. And then there's another one in New Mexico and Arizona called Advocates for Snake Preservation. Following both of those on social media are a really, really great way to learn about how we can support snakes.
Great. All right. Dr. Taylor, is there anything else that you were hoping to talk about today?
No, this has been so great to talk to you.
All right. I've really enjoyed it. And I appreciate you and the work that you're doing and the work that your lab is doing. And thank you again.
Thank you.
And just one more thing. Thanks to Kat Hill for editing help this week. Thanks for sticking through the entire episode. If you made it this far, I hope that it means that you enjoyed it. If so, please spread the word and share this episode with 3 friends or groups that you think would enjoy it too. As for today's episode, let me know. Did I miss anything? Was there a topic I should have covered? Let me know at podcast@jumpstartnature.com or DM me on any of my social accounts. I'll do my best to answer your questions. You can find me at Nature's Archive, one word, on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. I also share photography, nature stories, and much more on those accounts, so you can follow just to stay in touch, too. And despite being called crazy by numerous friends and colleagues, last year I left my tech career behind to start Jumpstart Nature, which Nature's Archive is now part of. For the sake of myself, my family, and the planet, I need to make this work. So please also consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/jumpstartnature. I offer some exclusive content and perks, and you can start donations as low as $4 a month. Lastly, please also check out our latest creation. It's the Jumpstart Nature podcast. We just completed our pilot season, where each episode reveals an unseen, surprising, or misunderstood nature topic with the help of experts and our host, Griff Griffith. It's entertaining and inspiring, and even reached number 3 on the Apple Nature podcast charts. There's much more on our roadmap, but we need your support, so check out jumpstartnature.com for more details. Thank you.